Hello, everyone, and welcome to History Inscribed. Today, we're going to be looking at a deed poll Pennsylvania land document from the year 1799. And I got this document for less than the price of a good sandwich, definitely under $20. In my last video, I made the point that you do not have to be wealthy to start a historical document collection. And even though I got this for under $20, I believe it was a good deal. I believe it was undervalued. And I'm going to explain why as we go. In the first part of the video, I'm going to talk about the acquisition, because that will help you know how to buy these documents and how to spot deals. In the second half, we'll talk about the history behind this document. And it's actually more interesting than you think. It's more interesting than just one guy selling a piece of land to another guy in the year 1799. This document actually ties into one of the first major financial crashes in the young United States. It ties into land fraud and bankruptcy law and treaties and all kinds of things. So let's talk about the acquisition side first. Now, I got this because the seller made a number of mistakes in selling this document on eBay. And I'm not knocking the seller, because a lot of people come into old documents and they just want to sell them for whatever they can get for them. They don't want to do the extra research and everything that would be necessary to necessarily sell for top dollar. And that's fine. So I'm not saying, oh, I'm so smart and I'm a genius, I figured this out, and the seller didn't know what they're doing. I'm just pointing these out so that you can recognize the same things and maybe get a good deal of your own. So what did the seller do wrong? Well, number one, generic title. And description. Okay, they listed this as a colonial document in the title. And then they just threw a bunch of random words like land, grant, deed, that kind of thing. Now, colonial is a problem because this was the year 1799. And 1799 is known as the Federal period. Just so you know, colonial is going to be around, for the English colony, 1607 to the 1775. And then you have the war, of course, 1783. This period, 1783, the end of the war, too. Most people will place it around the 1820s. That's known as the Federal period, when the country was young, trying to figure out what form of government was going to take. And the problem with listing a federal document as a colonial document is there's two different collector bases, right? People searching for specifically a colonial document would click on this, see the date, and say, I'm out. It's not interesting. I want a colonial document. At the same time, anyone searching for a federal document isn't going to find it. So describing things accurately is important, because a lot of people are browsing when they come across these types of things. They're not specifically looking for this particular document. Also, the seller listed this in the 1800 to 1900 category, but it should have been in the pre-1800 category. Okay. The seller also put this for auction. And really, this should have been more of a buy it now. The auction ended on a weekday at lunchtime. And that is not a good time to end an auction, honestly. Most people will end their auctions on Sunday nights. That's when you're going to have the most eyeballs across all the time zones. And the biggest mistake was not looking into the history of the document. So this is a deed poll between someone named Robert Church and Joseph Thomas. The biggest mistake is not recognizing that Joseph Thomas was a lawyer and agent for Robert Morris. Robert Morris is one of the founding fathers of the U.S. He was considered the financier, one of the top financiers of the Revolution. And at this point in time, after the Revolution, he was engaged in massive land speculation, not just in Pennsylvania, but in several states. And it really echoes into what happened in the 2000s, 2007 and 2008. Robert Morris and a few of his business partners were buying land and packaging it up, selling it abroad. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's go into the history side of this. So in 1784, Pennsylvania signs the Treaty of Fort Stanwix with the Iroquois Indians. And this allows the state, the young state, to buy up all the extra land that's in Pennsylvania and start handing it out to settlers. This would be the western portion of the state, also the northeastern portion where this document is concerned. So by the early 1790s, there's massive speculation. The state tries to limit land parcels to 400 acres per person. But this doesn't work because of the shenanigans that are involved here. So Joseph Thomas was known as an aggressive lawyer for Robert Morris, and he was involved in these shell companies and buying up this land. He would get people like Robert Church, regular townspeople, to access a claim to the land and then immediately sell that claim to him, and they would be packaged into these larger packages and sold to investors. Now, what's interesting in land documents, anytime you're dealing with land documents, there are a couple things that make it interesting to collectors. The big thing, of course, would be who's involved and if they signed it, any interesting signatures, anything like that. But the other thing is the size of the land and the amount of money, the transactions for the transaction. Usually the larger the transaction, the more interesting it is to collectors. This is kind of an interesting case because we can see the tract of land involves 400 acres, so that's the maximum that the state was allowing, which is rather large. But the sum is 5 shillings specie, which is interesting in itself because in 1799, these legal forms were still using shillings, Pennsylvania shillings instead of dollars. But anyway, that's a very small amount. It's a very small amount for a transaction of that size. So we can tell this isn't a normal land transaction. This is kind of a underhanded shell game that's going on where Robert Church was likely paid under the table just to acquire the land and pass it into the shell corporation or whatever Joseph Thomas was trying to do at this point. I should mention that this bubble started to pop in the late 1790s, and by 1797 you had a major crash. Robert Morris is actually going to go to debtor's prison for 3 years. Before he does this, he's actually hiding out in his house because the law at that time said that you could not arrest a man for debts in his own home. So people are camping out on his lawns waiting for him to emerge so that he could be arrested. and he's kind of under self-imposed house arrest for a while. He finally comes out and goes right to jail in Philadelphia. So that places us here at 1799. What makes this document interesting, right? Robert Morris is in debtor's prison at this time, and Joseph Thomas is still buying. He's still trying to piece together this land, and they're trying to cover their debts. And that's what this document represents. It's kind of a fragment of one of the big financial crises of the early United States. And it's very similar, like I said, to what happens 200 years later with the subprime mortgage crisis, the bundling of the mortgage-backed securities. The same thing was happening, where they were bundling all these land grants, and instead of selling just the individual land, they're selling stock in these companies. But the problem is the land couldn't back the promises. The land was poorly surveyed. It had conflicting claims. Some of it was, could not be developed. It was on a mountainside or something like that. So it's really interesting how human nature doesn't really change. There's another angle to this that you could look at too, which is what we call the Pennamite Wars. Seems to be totally forgotten in U.S. history, but it's going to sound a little strange. The state of Connecticut actually had a claim running all the way to the Pacific Ocean, a 70-mile strip of land that was promised to them in their original charter. And so they claimed parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, mainly those states, because they dropped the claim eventually. But that's why we get to like the Western Reserve in Ohio. If you've ever heard of Case Western Reserve, that's where that comes from. That was Connecticut's Western Reserve. But in this county, Luzerne, that was the site of a lot of Pennamite conflict, where settlers from Connecticut had been coming for decades, claiming this land. At the same time, you had Pennsylvania issuing titles to this land, and they actually had forced evictions and some minor skirmishes and everything, and it was just an ongoing battle between Pennsylvanians and Connecticut settlers. And so around this time, they were settling all that. Pennsylvania was winning out and firmly claiming the land, but they compromised a little bit and let some of the Connecticut settlers keep their land. But basically, the point of this is the land titles in this county, Luzerne, which came from Northumberland County, is now Wyoming County, to make things even more confusing. The titles were a mess. So you could see why we have some Better Call Saul attorneying going on here from Joseph Thomas, trying to probably clear up these tracts of land while his boss is in prison and while the whole shell game is collapsing around him. It's a pretty interesting document. I did try to find out where exactly this tract was, and because this isn't the final deed, this isn't the final land patent, it's a deed poll, which means it was a claim to survey the land. It was not the final, what we would call a deed. It doesn't give a real detailed description of the land. It just says it's 400 acres adjoining the land granted to Jacob Church by warrant of the 20th day of September, 1794. I wasn't able to find Robert Church anywhere in the land grant archives, but I did find other church members. I couldn't find Jacob Church either, but I found George Church, who also signed a deed poll to Joseph Thomas. So based on that, I would conclude that this land in this document is probably adjoining that or very close to it. And it was about 10 to 15 miles west of Scranton, modern day Scranton. the land in question was on the Susquehanna River, 4 miles south of Bowman's Creek. This would be modern day Eaton Township, if you're familiar with that area. That's where the land was in question. Once again, a great document. We should mention at the top here, it was printed by Henry Tuckness, number 25, Church Alley in Philadelphia. Henry Tuckness was a mid-tier printer who specialized in Bibles and religious texts. So the fact that he's printing these blank legal documents kind of speaks to the mania phase of the bubble, when everybody wanted to get in on it. That's how I interpret this. Everybody wanted to get in on the land rush business.
I also want to show you the paper composition. So if we hold it up to a bright light, you can see these chain lines and laid lines in the paper. One of the reasons this paper is still around is because it's actually cotton linen. It is not wood pulp or tree paper, and it's very resilient. It will last centuries if kept away from UV light and humidity. So just want to show you that. You can see this is not a modern reproduction. It's not printed on printer paper or anything like that. It is the original rag paper. We can tell by these lines because the paper was beaten to a pulp, the rags, and they were placed on metal mesh. And these lines are permanently imprinted in the document itself. So very interesting. It's a way you can tell that old paper is actually made of what it's supposed to be made of for these documents.
So we see also down here the wax seal or wafer seal is still intact. It's got good eye appeal. I'm not entirely sure about the cut down here. It doesn't look haphazard. I wasn't sure if this is a security measure where these cuts would fold into a copy that was cut from beneath it, and it was kind of a crude security measure, like a lock and key kind of thing. I wasn't sure if it was that or if this was a cancellation. I can't get a clear answer on that, but none of the important text is cut off at the bottom. So I think it's a pretty good acquisition. I think it's a good deal for less than the price of a Subway sandwich. And once again, I'll just reiterate that what can we learn about this? Number one, human nature doesn't really change. Number two, the rich are always going to speculate in land. It seems to be something that is always going to happen. It's a great vehicle for wealthy people to put their money. I do have to give them props in the 1790s because the speculators actually went to jail. That would never happen today. Robert Morris today would be declared too big to fail. And he did get out of debtor's prison because the U.S. finally passed a bankruptcy law in, I believe it was 1800. And he got out shortly after that, I think in 1801. But he lived in poverty after that. So to see people punished, and especially him being a hero of the revolution, a founding father, signed the Declaration, everything, to see how he actually was punished for this financial land speculation, and I guess you could say it was fraud in some ways. That's pretty interesting to me. And also, once again, the big takeaway here is you don't have to be wealthy to start collecting historical documents. You can find deals like this. It's a great way to learn more about everything because I didn't know all the stuff. I knew some and I knew bits and pieces, but when you buy a document, you're going to want to research that document. You're going to learn things that you're not going to hear even on podcasts, even on YouTube. They tend to stick to battles and main scandals and things like that, not so much this forgotten past. So it's really interesting. So I hope you enjoyed this little bit of a deep dive here into a 1799 document. Thank you for watching History Inscribed.